The gavel struck with finality as Herbert Wilson clutched his worn leather folder, knuckles white with desperation. At 72, his weathered face told the story of 5 decades working the same Nebraska soil, a life spent battling drought, debt, and heartbreak. But today, as the auctioneer's voice echoed through the county courthouse, the old veteran faced the cruelest blow yet. Watching Willow Creek Farm, land that had been in his family for generations, slip away to the highest bidder. It wasn't until he slowly opened his briefcase that the room fell completely silent, the contents inside changing everything in an instant. The morning had begun with quiet determination, as Herbert dressed in his only suit, a navy blue ensemble he'd purchased for his daughter's wedding 15 years earlier. The jacket hung loosely on his frame now, his body having grown leaner with age and hard work. He'd polished his old dress shoes meticulously the night before, though they still showed deep creases and scuffs that no amount of polish could hide. In the small bathroom mirror, he straightened his tie and ran a hand through his silver hair. "Today's the day, Margaret," he whispered to the empty room, a habit he'd maintained in the 5 years since his wife's passing. Her photo still sat on the dresser, her smile frozen in time, offering silent support as it had through the decades of their marriage. Herbert pulled the leather folder from his closet, checking its contents one final time before placing it carefully into an old briefcase that had belonged to his father. The clasps were tarnished but secure. Inside rested his hopes, his history, and perhaps his future, if luck and justice were with him today. Willow Creek Farm stretched across 180 acres of prime Nebraska farmland, with rich soil that had produced corn, wheat, and soybeans through multiple generations of Wilsons. Herbert had been born in the white farmhouse that stood at the property's center, had learned to walk on its wooden floors, and had brought his bride Margaret there in 1973 after returning from Vietnam. They'd raised their children under that. A roof, weathered economic storms, and mourned together when their son Michael was killed in Desert Storm. The farm had been more than land to Herbert. It was his heritage, his identity. But 3 consecutive years of drought had strained his finances beyond recovery. The bank had called in his loans, and despite his protests and appeals, Willow Creek Farm was to be auctioned to the highest bidder that very morning. The drive to the county courthouse took 20 minutes, each familiar landmark along the way feeling like a silent witness to his failure. Herbert's ancient pickup truck rattled and protested as he parked it in the courthouse lot, several spaces away from the gleaming SUVs and luxury sedans that belonged to the land developers and corporate farming representatives who would soon bid on his legacy. Herbert gripped the briefcase tightly as he climbed the courthouse steps, his bad knee, a souvenir from the war, protesting with each upward movement. Inside, the main meeting room had been arranged for the auction, rows of chairs facing a small podium where County Commissioner Davis would oversee the proceedings. Herbert recognized most faces, neighbors, farmers from adjacent counties, and several men in expensive suits who represented corporate agricultural interests. In the front row sat Clayton Reynolds, owner of Reynolds AgriCorp, a man whose company had been buying up struggling family farms across 3 counties. His tailored suit and confident posture spoke of wealth and certainty. Next to him sat his son, Brandon, equally well-dressed but with a bored expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Herbert took a seat in the back row, placing his briefcase carefully at his feet. Several people nodded in his direction, their eyes filled with a pity that stung worse than outright disdain would have. These were people he'd known for decades, had helped during harvests, had shared equipment with, had celebrated weddings, and mourned at funerals alongside. Now they watched as his life's work went on the auction block. Commissioner Davis, a portly man with thinning hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, called the room to order precisely at 9 o'clock. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending today's auction of property ID number 4587B, commonly known as Willow Creek Farm, comprising 180 acres of agricultural land with improvements including the farmhouse, 2 barns, and various outbuildings. Herbert's throat tightened as Davis continued with the legal descriptions and terms of sale. The commissioner avoided making eye contact with him. They had gone to high school together, had played on the same baseball team, had been friends, until politics and positions had gradually separated them over the years. The opening bid will be set at $850,000, consistent with the outstanding loan amount plus fees, Davis announced. Do I have an opening bid? Clayton Reynolds raised his hand immediately. $850, he said casually, as if the amount were pocket change rather than more money than Herbert had seen in his lifetime. Another bidder, a representative from Midwest Farming Collective, countered with $875,000. Herbert watched numbly as the figures climbed, each increase representing another nail in the coffin of his family's legacy. By the time the bidding reached $950,000, only Reynolds and the Midwest representative remained active. $950 going once, Commissioner Davis announced, his gavel poised. Going twice. I'd like to say something. Herbert's voice surprised even himself, stronger and clearer than he expected. All heads turned toward him as he slowly stood, his knees cracking audibly in the sudden silence. Herbert, Commissioner Davis said, removing his glasses, I understand this is difficult, but the proceedings are... I've sat quiet long enough. Bill, Herbert interrupted, using the commissioner's first name deliberately. Before you sell off my family's land, I think these folks should know what they're really bidding on. Davis hesitated, glancing at the county attorney who sat nearby. The attorney gave a small, reluctant nod. 2 minutes, Herbert, Davis conceded. As a courtesy, Herbert made his way slowly to the front of the room, bringing his briefcase with him. He could feel Clayton Reynolds' cold stare, the impatient shifting of the corporate representatives, the uncomfortable glances exchanged by his neighbors. Standing before them, Herbert suddenly felt every one of his 72 years. His hands trembled slightly as he placed his briefcase on the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. Most of you know me, he began, his voice gaining strength. I've worked Willow Creek Farm for 53 years. Took it over from my daddy, who got it from his daddy, Wilson Land, since 1893. He paused, letting the history sink in. What you might not know is what that land has cost and what it's given. In return, Herbert unlatched his briefcase with deliberate movements. My great-grandfather Thomas Wilson homesteaded that land after losing an arm at Gettysburg. My grandfather John expanded it during the Depression, somehow keeping it when most others lost everything. From the briefcase, Herbert withdrew a faded photograph in a simple frame. A young man in a World War II uniform, standing proudly beside a much younger version of the same white farmhouse that still stood on Willow Creek Farm. My father, James Wilson, fought at Normandy, came home with shrapnel in his back that pained him till the day he died, but never once complained while working from sunrise to sunset to make that land produce. Herbert placed the photo carefully. on the podium and removed another, this one of himself, much younger, in jungle fatigues, the Vietnam terrain visible behind him. I left that land to serve in Vietnam. 2 tours. Bronze Star that I never thought I deserved when better men than me didn't come home. His voice cracked slightly. That land was waiting when I returned, when other folks weren't always welcoming to those of us who fought in that war. A murmur went through the room as Herbert continued to remove items from his briefcase. A folded flag in a triangular case, a photo of a young man in desert camouflage. My son, Michael. My only boy. Herbert's voice was barely above a whisper. Now, he grew up on that land, learned to walk in those fields, learned to drive on that old dirt road. He died in Iraq during the First Gulf War. This flag covered his coffin. The room had gone completely silent. Even Clayton Reynolds had lost. His impatient expression, his eyes fixed on the items Herbert had arranged on the podium. 4 generations of Wilson men have bled for this country, Herbert continued, strength returning to his voice. And when we weren't bleeding overseas, we were pouring our sweat and tears into this land, growing food that fed our neighbors and our nation. From the briefcase, Herbert removed a stack of papers, some yellowed with age, others newer. I hold here the original homestead certificate signed by President Cleveland. I have the deed my grandfather used to expand during the Depression. I have my father's GI Bill paperwork that helped modernize our irrigation. Herbert's hands moved to newer documents. I have the mortgage papers I signed after Margaret's cancer treatments drained our savings. And I have the foreclosure notice. That brings us here today. Herbert looked directly at Clayton Reynolds now. Mr. Reynolds, you see 180 acres of soil that your company can profit from. I see the blood and sweat of 4 generations. You see a business opportunity. I see my son's first steps, my daughter's wedding under the old oak tree, and my wife's garden that still blooms every spring, though she's been gone 5 years now. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but maintained eye contact. Herbert reached into his briefcase one final time and removed a small wooden box. Opening it carefully, he revealed a collection of military medals, dog tags, and service ribbons. This land isn't just dirt and crops, Mr. Reynolds. It's a monument to sacrifice, my family's sacrifice for this country. Each of these medals represents blood spilled, so that men like you could build businesses and profit freely. Each of these has been earned by a Wilson man while defending American soil. Soil not so different from the 180 acres you're so eager to acquire. Herbert's gaze swept the room, taking in the uncomfortable expressions, the downcast eyes, and a few faces showing dawning recognition. I'm not asking for charity. I've never taken a handout in my life, but I am asking for respect for what this land represents. When you bid today, know that you're not just buying acreage. You're purchasing a piece of American history, watered with the blood of patriots. He began to carefully return the items to his briefcase, his arthritic fingers, moving slowly but with purpose. The room remained utterly silent, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of Herbert's words and the visual testimony of his family's service. Commissioner Davis cleared his throat, clearly moved but bound by procedure. Thank you, Herbert. We appreciate your family's service and sacrifice, but unfortunately, the auction must proceed according to law. Herbert nodded, securing his briefcase. I understand the law, Bill. I've defended it enough times. He turned to head back to his seat when a voice from the back of the room interrupted. Commissioner, if I may. All heads turned to see an unfamiliar figure rise from a chair in the corner. A woman in her early 40s, dressed in a crisp uniform, adorned with the insignia of the United States Army. Her posture was ramrod straight, her expression professional but compassionate. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Army," she introduced herself. "I represent the Veterans Land Retention Program, a new initiative created by the last Farm Bill." Herbert stared at the woman in confusion. He had never heard of such a program, and from the expressions around the room, neither had anyone else. Colonel Mitchell moved confidently to the front of the room, her boots clicking against the wooden floor with military precision. She nodded respectfully to Herbert before addressing the room. The Veterans Land Retention Program was established to prevent the forced sale of agricultural properties owned by veterans who have fallen on temporary financial hardship, she explained, her voice carrying authority without aggression. Mr. Wilson's case was brought to our attention 3 weeks ago by Congressman Anderson's office. Herbert's confusion deepened. He hadn't contacted any congressman. He'd spent months fighting the bank through proper channels, filling out endless forms and making desperate phone calls, but had never thought to reach out to his representative. "Under the provisions of the program," Colonel Mitchell continued, "veterans who have maintained active agricultural operations for over 20 years and who can demonstrate temporary economic hardship due to factors beyond their control, such as the recent drought conditions affecting this region, may qualify for an emergency stay of auction and restructuring of existing debt." Clayton Reynolds shifted forward in his chair, his previously sympathetic expression hardening. "With all due respect, Colonel, this auction has been properly noticed and scheduled according to state law. My company has invested considerable resources in preparing for this acquisition." Colonel Mitchell turned toward Reynolds, her expression neutral but resolute. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand your position. However, federal law governing veterans' benefits supersedes state auction procedures in qualified cases." She produced a folder from her briefcase. "I have the relevant documentation here, including a temporary stay order signed by Judge Hamilton of the Federal District Court." Commissioner Davis accepted the papers with evident surprise, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed them. "This appears to be in order, but it's highly unusual. I've never seen this program implemented before." "It's a recent initiative," Colonel Mitchell explained. "Mr. Wilson's case is among the first to qualify." She turned to address the room more broadly. "The United States government recognizes the contributions of its veterans, not just through words but through meaningful action. When those who have served face losing their livelihoods and heritage due to temporary setbacks, we believe intervention is appropriate." Herbert stood motionless, afraid to hope yet unable to suppress the flutter of possibility in his chest. "I never applied for any program," he said quietly. Colonel Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "No, sir, you didn't. But your daughter, Emily, did." Herbert's eyes widened. "Emily lived 3 states away in Colorado with her husband and children. They spoke weekly, and she had been devastated by the news of the farm's foreclosure, but he had no idea she'd taken action on his behalf." "Emily contacted Congressman Anderson directly," Colonel Mitchell explained. "She submitted your service, records, the farm's financial history, and documentation of the drought impact on regional agriculture. The case was flagged for immediate review." Commissioner Davis cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected turn of events. It seems we have a legal obligation to postpone today's proceedings pending review of this federal intervention. He looked apologetically toward Reynolds and the other bidders. I'm afraid we'll have to suspend the auction temporarily. Clayton. Reynolds rose from his seat, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with a deliberate motion. Commissioner, my legal team will need to review these documents. If this is some last-minute delaying tactic, I assure you, Mr. Reynolds, the Veterans Land Retention Program is legitimate, Colonel Mitchell replied evenly. You're welcome to have your attorneys contact the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Agriculture. All relevant statutes are cited in the documentation provided. Reynolds' son Brandon leaned toward his father, whispering something that made the older man's expression darken further. After a moment's consideration, Reynolds addressed Herbert directly. Mr. Wilson, I respect your service and your family's military tradition. Truly, I do. His tone suggested sincerity despite his obvious frustration. But sentiment aside, the economic realities remain. Your farm has been operating at a loss for 3 consecutive seasons. No restructuring will change the fundamental viability issues. Herbert straightened his shoulders, feeling a strange mix of hope and indignation. Mr. Reynolds, my farm operated successfully for over 100 years before these drought years. One bad stretch doesn't erase a century of sound management. The agricultural landscape has changed, Reynolds countered. Small family farms simply aren't sustainable in today's economy. That's not personal, it's business reality. An unexpected voice joined the conversation from several rows back, a woman in her 30s wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. That's not entirely accurate. All eyes turned to Jessica Harmon, whose family operated a modest organic farm 10 miles outside town. Herbert knew her parents well, though Jessica had left for college and only returned to take over the family operation 5 years earlier after getting a degree in sustainable agriculture. The Wilson farm sits on some of the best soil in the county, Jessica continued, standing as she spoke, with updated irrigation techniques and a shift towards specialty crops. That land could be extremely productive, even on a family farm scale. Reynolds smiled condescendingly. Ms. Harmon, I believe, from the Harmon Organic Operation? Your boutique approach works for your niche market, but traditional commodity farming at the Wilson scale could be transitioned, Jessica interrupted. I've spoken with Herbert about this before. His land has the perfect conditions for several high-value crops that are currently undersupplied in regional markets. Herbert nodded slowly. Jessica had indeed approached him the previous year with ideas about transitioning portions of his acreage to specialty crops. But with his financial troubles mounting, he hadn't been in a position to risk changing his established practices, regardless of their diminishing returns. Colonel Mitchell listened to this exchange with interest. Viability assessments are part of the program review. If there's evidence that with appropriate modernization and strategic crop selection, the farm could return to profitability, that would strengthen Mr. Wilson's case considerably. Commissioner Davis checked his watch. Given these developments, I believe we have no choice but to postpone today's auction for at least 30 days, pending the federal review process. He banged his gavel. This auction is officially suspended until further notice. The room erupted in murmurs as the bidders began gathering their materials. Clayton Reynolds approached Herbert directly, his son trailing behind him. This is merely a delay, Mr. Wilson, he said quietly. My offer to purchase your property privately remains open. slightly above the opening bid price. It would give you the dignity of a clean exit rather than prolonging the inevitable. Herbert met the younger man's gaze steadily. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Reynolds, but I'm not looking for an exit, dignified or otherwise. That land is my home. Reynolds nodded curtly and turned to leave, his son casting a final curious glance at Herbert before following his father out. As the room gradually emptied, Herbert found himself standing alone with Colonel Mitchell and Jessica Harmon, who had approached the front once the auction dispersed. "I should thank you both," Herbert said, still processing the morning's unexpected turn, "though I'm not entirely sure what just happened." Colonel Mitchell smiled, the first break in her professional demeanor. "What happened is that you have a daughter who refuses to give up on her father's legacy, Mr. Wilson." Emily was quite persuasive in her appeals to the congressman. "And I've been saying for years that your South 40 has perfect conditions for heritage grain varieties," Jessica added. "The premium markets for those crops could transform your operation's economics." Herbert shook his head in bewilderment. "I'm just a simple farmer. All this talk of programs and premium markets, it's a bit beyond me." "That's where I come in," Colonel Mitchell explained. "Part of my role is to connect qualifying veterans with the technical expertise and transitional resources needed to make their operations viable again." She glanced at Jessica. "It sounds like you may already have a local expert willing to consult." Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "More than willing. The Wilson farm is an institution in this county. Seeing it carved up by Reynolds Agricorp would be a tragedy." Herbert carefully returned the military medals to his briefcase, his weathered hands moving with reverence. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now," Colonel Mitchell replied, "we have 30 days to develop a comprehensive viability plan for your farm. If approved, you'll receive restructured financing, technical assistance, and possibly grants for modernization. It won't be easy, Mr. Wilson, but it could give you a fighting chance to keep your land." The three of them walked together out of the courthouse into the bright Nebraska morning. Herbert squinted against the sunlight, looking in the direction of his farm, visible as a distant patchwork of fields on the horizon. "I never wanted charity," he said quietly. "My father and his father before him would turn in their graves if they thought I couldn't manage on my own." "This isn't charity," Colonel Mitchell corrected him. "Your family has paid in advance with blood and service. The country owes its veterans more than just medals and memorial services." Jessica touched Herbert's arm gently. "And neighbors help neighbors, Mr. Wilson. That's how it's always been in farming communities. My father always said your dad helped him get started when no one else would give him the time of day." Herbert remembered that time. Nearly 40 years ago, when Jessica's father had been a young man with a young family, trying to establish himself with limited resources and experience. James Wilson had indeed taken the younger farmer under his wing, sharing equipment, knowledge, and encouragement. "Your dad was a good man," Herbert acknowledged. "He paid back every favor tenfold over the years." "Then let me do the same," Jessica insisted. "I've learned things in my studies and travels that could help your farm adapt to changing conditions. Together with this program, we might just save Willow Creek Farm." For the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in months, Herbert felt something like hope flickering in his chest. He looked from Jessica's earnest face to Colonel Mitchell's professional competence and realized he was no longer fighting alone. "I should call Emily," he said finally. "Thank her for not giving up on her old man." Colonel Mitchell smiled. "I have a feeling she gets her determination honestly, Mr. Wilson." She handed him her card. "I'll be in touch tomorrow to begin the formal assessment process. In the meantime, try to rest. Today was just the first step in what might be a journey." Herbert nodded, tucking the card carefully into his jacket pocket alongside the small photo of Margaret he always carried. As Colonel Mitchell departed with a crisp nod, Jessica remained, her expression thoughtful. "If you're not too tired, Mr. Wilson, I'd actually love to walk some of your land this afternoon. The sooner we start planning, the better our chances." Herbert considered the offer. He'd planned to spend the day alone, nursing his wounds, and perhaps saying a premature goodbye to the fields he loved. Instead, here was an opportunity to begin fighting back. "I think Margaret would approve of that plan," he said, the ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. "And please, call me Herbert. Anyone fighting to save my farm has earned the right to use my first name." As they walked toward Herbert's old pickup truck, Jessica began explaining her ideas for the South 40, technical terms and market projections that Herbert only partially understood. But beneath the details was something he recognized clearly: passion for the land and determination to see it flourish. Climbing into his truck, Herbert carefully placed his briefcase on the seat between them, the case that had held not just his family's military legacy, but unexpectedly opened the door to his farm's possible salvation. As they drove toward Willow Creek Farm, the Nebraska sun high overhead, Herbert allowed himself to imagine something he hadn't dared consider in months: a future where the Wilson name remained connected to the land his ancestors had cherished. The farm came into view as they crested the final hill. The white farmhouse with its weathered porch, the red barn in need of fresh paint, the fields stretching to the horizon. It wasn't just soil and buildings, it was the physical manifestation of a family's history. And perhaps, Herbert thought as he turned down the familiar drive, it might yet be its future as well. Jessica's boots crunched over the drought-hardened soil of the South 40 as she knelt to examine the earth more closely. Herbert stood a few paces away, leaning slightly on his walking stick, watching as the young woman crumbled dirt between her fingers and held it to her nose. "The soil structure is still excellent," she announced, rising to her feet and brushing off her hands. "Even with the drought, you've maintained good organic matter. That's rare, Herbert. Most conventional operations would have seen significant degradation after 3 dry years." Herbert shrugged modestly. "My father was religious about crop rotation and cover crops, said taking care of the soil was like taking care of your rifle. In the service, neglect either one, and they'll fail you when you need them most." Jessica smiled, jotting notes in a small, weatherproof notebook she'd produced from her pocket. "Your father was ahead of his time. These regenerative practices are what the agricultural schools are all teaching now, but he knew it from experience." They continued walking the perimeter of the field, Jessica stopping occasionally to take soil samples in small plastic bags or to photograph particular features with her phone. Herbert found himself impressed by her methodical approach and clear expertise, though some of her terminology went over his head. "What exactly are you looking for?" he finally asked as she examined a drainage pattern with particular interest. "Potential," Jessica replied, straightening up. "This 40-acre section has a unique microclimate and soil composition that's perfect for ancient grain varieties: einkorn, emmer, spelt. They command premium prices in specialty markets, and they're more drought-resistant than conventional." "Wheat," Herbert frowned skeptically. Fancy grains? I've always grown what people need. Corn, soybeans, standard wheat. Not sure there's much market for exotic stuff around here." Jessica's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "That's just it. You wouldn't be selling locally. There's a growing national market for these heritage grains, especially for artisanal bakeries and health-conscious consumers. They'll pay 3 to 5 times the price of conventional wheat." She pulled out her phone and showed him photos of rustic loaves of bread and packages of specialty flour with premium price tags. Herbert's eyebrows rose despite his skepticism. "And people actually pay those prices for flour?" "Absolutely. The gluten structure and flavor profiles are completely different from modern wheat varieties. Plus, there's the story factor. Heritage grains grown on a multi-generational family farm using sustainable practices. That narrative adds value in today's market." Herbert shook his head, bemused. "In my day, we just called it farming. Didn't know we were creating narratives." Jessica laughed, a warm sound that reminded Herbert how long it had been since laughter had echoed across his fields. "The work is the same, honest and essential. It's just the marketing that's changed." They continued their survey, moving toward the creek that gave the farm its name. The waterway was running low, but hadn't dried up completely, a testament to the natural springs that fed it from underground sources. "This water access is another significant asset," Jessica observed. "With the right irrigation system, you could maximize efficiency even in dry years." She paused, studying Herbert's expression. "You don't seem convinced." Herbert sighed, leaning more heavily on his walking stick. "It's not that I don't appreciate your ideas, Jessica. They sound promising. But implementing all this, new crops, new markets, new equipment, takes capital I simply don't have. Even if Colonel Mitchell's program postpones the auction, I'd just be delaying the inevitable without substantial investment." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fair concern. But the Veterans Land Retention Program includes grant opportunities specifically for modernization and transition costs. And there are other funding sources we could pursue: sustainable agriculture initiatives, heritage preservation grants." "More paperwork," Herbert grumbled, though without real heat. "Seems like farming these days requires more time filling out forms than actually working the land." "Unfortunately, that's partly true," Jessica conceded. "But I could help with that side of things. My degree included agricultural policy and grant writing. It's just another tool in the modern farmer's toolkit." They reached the creek bank and stood in silence for a moment, watching the water flow sluggishly between moss-covered stones. This spot had always been special to Herbert. As a boy, he'd caught his first fish here. As a young father, he'd taught his own children to swim in the deeper pools downstream. "My son Michael used to catch crawdads right where you're standing," Herbert said suddenly, the memory rising unbidden. "Built elaborate traps out of old mason jars and string. Margaret would scold him for coming home muddy, but she always helped him release the crawdads back to the creek after he'd studied them." Jessica listened quietly, understanding the importance of these memories attached to the land. "This farm isn't just about economics for you," she observed softly. Herbert nodded, his weathered face solemn. "Every acre holds memories. Every field has seen joys and sorrows. When I walk this land, I'm walking alongside ghosts, good ghosts mostly. My father teaching me to drive a tractor, Margaret hanging laundry on the line behind the house, Michael running through the corn rows playing hide-and-seek." His voice caught slightly. "Hard to put a price on that." "We won't have to," Jessica assured him with quiet determination. The economic case will be strong enough on its own merits. As they turned back toward the farmhouse, Herbert noticed a black SUV pulling up his driveway, sending a plume of dust into the afternoon air. "Expecting visitors?" Jessica asked. Herbert squinted against the sun. "No, but that looks like Reynolds' vehicle." Sure enough, Clayton Reynolds emerged from the driver's side, while his son Brandon exited the passenger door. Both men wore casual clothes now, rather than the suits they'd worn to the auction. But Clayton Reynolds still carried himself with the same confident authority. Herbert and Jessica met them in the yard beside the old oak tree where generations of Wilson children had played on a tire swing that still hung from a sturdy branch. "Mr. Wilson," Reynolds greeted him with a nod. "Miss Harmon." "Reynolds," Herbert acknowledged. "Didn't expect to see you out this way." "I thought we might continue our conversation in a more private setting," Reynolds explained, his gaze taking in the farmhouse, barns, and fields with a calculating eye. "I see you're already discussing future plans for the property." "Just showing Jessica some of the land features," Herbert replied carefully, unwilling to reveal too much about their discussions. Brandon Reynolds had wandered a few steps away, examining the farmhouse with apparent interest. Unlike his father's calculating assessment, the younger man's gaze seemed almost appreciative. "This is an original craftsman style, isn't it?" Brandon asked, gesturing toward the house. "Probably built around 1910 or so." Herbert nodded, surprised by the young man's knowledge. 1914. My grandfather added the east wing in 1932. "The woodwork must be amazing inside," Brandon commented. "They don't build them like this anymore." Clayton Reynolds cleared his throat, redirecting the conversation. "Herbert, I'll be direct. This morning's interruption was unexpected, but it doesn't change the fundamental economics. Your farm hasn't turned a profit in 3 years, and retrofitting for specialty crops, as I presume Miss Harmon is suggesting, would require significant capital investment. We're exploring viable options," Jessica replied coolly, before Herbert could respond. "Of course," Reynolds said with a thin smile, "but I wanted to present a different perspective. My offer to purchase remains open, with a slight increase to show good faith. You could walk away with enough to secure a comfortable retirement, free from debt and worry." Herbert's expression remained neutral. "And what would happen to Willow Creek Farm under your ownership?" "Progress," Reynolds replied. "Simply, the house would likely be preserved. Brandon here has a sentimental streak about historic structures. The outbuildings would be replaced with modern facilities. The land would be consolidated with our adjacent holdings for maximum efficiency. And the Wilson name would disappear from the property after 4 generations, Herbert added quietly. Reynolds spread his hands in a gesture of inevitability. "That's the way of things, Herbert. Family farms are becoming relics of the past. It's not personal, it's economic evolution." Jessica stepped forward, her posture defensive, though her tone remained professional. "That's one perspective, Mr. Reynolds. Another is that with appropriate adaptation and support, family farms can remain viable and even thrive in specialty markets that corporate operations can't easily enter." Reynolds turned his attention to Jessica, his expression patronizing. "Miss Harmon, your enthusiasm is commendable, but your organic operation survives on premium pricing and direct-to-consumer sales. That model simply doesn't scale to operations of this size." "Actually," Jessica countered, "our transitional plan specifically addresses scale concerns through phased implementation and strategic market partnerships. The Veterans Land Retention Program provides exactly the bridge financing needed to make such transitions viable. Brandon Reynolds, who had been listening quietly, spoke up unexpectedly. "She might be right, Dad. The premium grain market has grown exponentially in the last 5 years. Our own analysts have suggested we should be exploring heritage crop divisions." Clayton shot his son a warning glance before turning back to Herbert. "The offer I'm making provides certainty. These alternative plans offer only possibilities and continued risk." Herbert studied Reynolds carefully. There was something in the man's insistence that seemed disproportionate to the business opportunity alone. "You seem particularly determined." "To acquire my land, Reynolds? More so than other properties you've purchased recently." A flicker of something, possibly discomfort, crossed Reynolds' face before his confident expression returned. "Your property is contiguous with our existing holdings. The efficiency gains are significant." "There's more to it than that," Herbert pressed. Intuition honed by decades of negotiations with grain buyers and equipment dealers alerting him that something wasn't being said. "What makes Willow Creek Farm so special to Reynolds Agricorp?" Brandon shifted his weight, glancing at his father. Clayton Reynolds maintained his composure, but hesitated just long enough for Herbert to know his suspicion was justified. "Dad," Brandon said quietly, "he has a right to know if we're making him an offer." Clayton sighed with evident frustration. "The preliminary geological surveys suggest there may be significant groundwater resources under the northwestern portion of your property. Pure, abundant aquifer access that could become increasingly valuable as regional drought conditions persist." Herbert's eyes narrowed. "Water rights. That's what this is really about." For the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in months, Herbert felt something like hope flickering in his chest. He looked from Jessica's earnest face to Colonel Mitchell's professional competence and realized he was no longer fighting alone. "I should call Emily," he said finally. "Thank her for not giving up on her old man." Colonel Mitchell smiled. "I have a feeling she gets her determination honestly, Mr. Wilson." She handed him her card. "I'll be in touch tomorrow to begin the formal assessment process. In the meantime, try to rest. Today was just the first step in what might be a journey." Herbert nodded, tucking the card carefully into his jacket pocket alongside the small photo of Margaret he always carried. As Colonel Mitchell departed with a crisp nod, Jessica remained, her expression thoughtful. "If you're not too tired, Mr. Wilson, I'd actually love to walk some of your land this afternoon. The sooner we start planning, the better our chances." Herbert considered the offer. He'd planned to spend the day alone, nursing his wounds, and perhaps saying a premature goodbye to the fields he loved. Instead, here was an opportunity to begin fighting back. "I think Margaret would approve of that plan," he said, the ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. "And please, call me Herbert. Anyone fighting to save my farm has earned the right to use my first name." As they walked toward Herbert's old pickup truck, Jessica began explaining her ideas for the South 40, technical terms and market projections that Herbert only partially understood. But beneath the details was something he recognized clearly: passion for the land and determination to see it flourish. Climbing into his truck, Herbert carefully placed his briefcase on the seat between them, the case that had held not just his family's military legacy but unexpectedly opened the door to his farm's possible salvation. As they drove toward Willow Creek Farm, the Nebraska sun high overhead, Herbert allowed himself to imagine something he hadn't dared consider in months: a future where the Wilson name remained connected to the land his ancestors had cherished. The farm came into view as they crested the final hill. The white farmhouse with its weathered porch, the red barn in need of fresh paint, the fields stretching to the horizon. It wasn't just soil and buildings, it was the physical manifestation of a family's history. And perhaps, Herbert thought as he turned down the familiar drive, it might yet be its future as well. Jessica's boots crunched over the drought-hardened soil of the South 40 as she knelt to examine the earth more closely. Herbert stood a few paces away, leaning slightly on his walking stick, watching as the young woman crumbled dirt between her fingers and held it to her nose. "The soil structure is still excellent," she announced, rising to her feet and brushing off her hands. "Even with the drought, you've maintained good organic matter. That's rare, Herbert. Most conventional operations would have seen significant degradation after 3 dry years." Herbert shrugged modestly. "My father was religious about crop rotation and cover crops. Said taking care of the soil was like taking care of your rifle. In the service, neglect either one, and they'll fail you when you need them most." Jessica smiled, jotting notes in a small, weatherproof notebook she'd produced from her pocket. "Your father was ahead of his time. These regenerative practices are what the agricultural schools are all teaching now, but he knew it from experience." They continued walking the perimeter of the field, Jessica stopping occasionally to take soil samples in small plastic bags or to photograph particular features with her phone. Herbert found himself impressed by her methodical approach and clear expertise, though some of her terminology went over his head. "What exactly are you looking for?" he finally asked as she examined a drainage pattern with particular interest. "Potential," Jessica replied, straightening up. "This 40-acre section has a unique microclimate and soil composition that's perfect for ancient grain varieties. Einkorn, emmer, spelt. They command premium prices in specialty markets, and they're more drought-resistant than conventional." "Wheat," Herbert frowned skeptically. "Fancy grains? I've always grown what people need: corn, soybeans, standard wheat. Not sure there's much market for exotic stuff around here." Jessica's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "That's just it. You wouldn't be selling locally. There's a growing national market for these heritage grains, especially for artisanal bakeries and health-conscious consumers. They'll pay 3 to 5 times the price of conventional wheat." She pulled out her phone and showed him photos of rustic loaves of bread and packages of specialty flour with premium price tags. Herbert's eyebrows rose despite his skepticism. Herbert woke before dawn the next morning, a habit formed over decades of farm life. For a moment, as consciousness returned, the weight of potential foreclosure pressed on his chest like a physical burden. Then he remembered. The auction had been suspended. Colonel Mitchell's intervention had bought him time, and Jessica's expertise had offered a glimmer of hope. Most significantly, Reynolds's unexpected revelation about the water beneath his land had transformed the stakes entirely. He dressed slowly, his joints stiff from yesterday's walking tour of the property. The smell of coffee drifted up the stairs. Jessica had accepted his offer to stay in the guest room rather than drive back to her farm late in the evening. They had worked until midnight, spreading maps across the kitchen table, Jessica taking detailed notes as Herbert shared his knowledge of the land's features and history. Downstairs he found Jessica already fully dressed, her laptop open on the kitchen table, a steaming mug beside it. "Hope you don't mind," she said, looking up from her screen. "I took the liberty of making coffee and borrowing your internet connection." "Mi casa es su casa," Herbert replied, pouring himself a cup from the old percolator. "You're up early." "Farm habits die hard," Jessica replied with a smile. "Besides, I wanted to compile our notes and send some preliminary information to Colonel Mitchell before she arrives." Herbert settled into a chair across from her. "She's coming here?" Jessica nodded. "I spoke with her last night after you went to bed. The water rights issue changes everything from a program perspective. She wants to see the property firsthand and discuss next steps." Herbert sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Never thought my little farm would warrant so much attention." "It's not little, Herbert," Jessica corrected gently. 180 acres of prime farmland with potentially significant water resources is a major agricultural asset. In the right hands, your hands, it could be a cornerstone property for sustainable regional farming. Herbert wasn't entirely comfortable with this framing of his family's land as a strategic resource, rather than simply his home and livelihood. But he understood the necessity of considering broader implications now. "I spoke with Emily last night too," he said, after a moment. "She was surprised about the water situation." "How did she take it?" "She's worried Reynolds might try something underhanded," Herbert admitted. "Says she's coming home this weekend with her husband to help sort things out." Jessica looked pleased. "That's excellent. Family support will be important, and having extra hands to help with the property assessment won't hurt either." Herbert gazed out the kitchen window at his fields, golden in the early morning light. "When I called, I expected her to be relieved that we might save the farm. Instead, she said she never doubted it would work out." He shook his head, smiling slightly. "Gets her stubbornness from her mother." They spent the morning preparing for Colonel Mitchell's visit. Herbert dug out old farm records, property surveys, and water table measurements his father had meticulously maintained. Jessica organized these into chronological order, creating a historical record of the farm's development and natural resources. Around mid-morning, Jessica's phone chimed with a text message. Her expression tightened as she read it. "Something wrong?" Herbert asked. "Maybe nothing," she replied, but her tone suggested otherwise. "A friend who works at the county clerk's office says Reynolds filed some paperwork this morning regarding water rights in this township." Herbert frowned. "What kind of paperwork?" "She doesn't know specifics yet. She's trying to get a look at the documents." Jessica set her phone down. "Reynolds isn't wasting any time." "He never struck me as the patient type," Herbert observed dryly. By 11 o'clock, Colonel Mitchell's government-issued SUV pulled up the driveway. She emerged wearing the same crisp uniform as the day before, though she'd exchanged her dress shoes for practical boots more suitable for a farm tour. "Mr. Wilson," she greeted Herbert with a firm handshake. "Thank you for accommodating this visit on short notice." "Please call me Herbert," he replied, finding himself standing straighter in the presence of her military bearing. "And thank you for coming all this way." Colonel Mitchell turned to Jessica. "Ms. Harmon, I've reviewed your preliminary notes. Very thorough work." Jessica accepted the compliment with a nod. "We've prepared additional documentation inside, including historical water table measurements that Herbert's family has maintained for generations." They settled in the kitchen, spreading documents across the table while Herbert served coffee. Colonel Mitchell reviewed the materials with methodical precision, occasionally asking clarifying questions about rainfall patterns, historical crop yields, and property boundaries. "These water table measurements are particularly valuable," she noted, examining a leather-bound ledger with James Wilson's careful handwriting. They demonstrate a stable underground resource despite surface drought conditions. That significantly impacts our viability assessment. Reynolds thinks so too, Herbert said, explaining yesterday's visit and the revelation about the aquifer. Colonel Mitchell's expression grew more serious as she listened. That complicates matters. Water rights disputes can become legally complex, especially when corporate agricultural interests are involved. Would that affect Herbert's eligibility for the program? Jessica asked, concern evident in her voice. Not necessarily, Colonel Mitchell replied carefully, but it does expand the scope of what we're protecting. This isn't just about preserving a veteran's farm anymore. It's about safeguarding a critical natural resource. Herbert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I'm not looking to become the center of some water rights battle, Colonel. I just want to keep my family's farm. I understand, Colonel Mitchell assured him, but the reality is that water access will be increasingly central to agricultural viability in this region. Protecting your rights to the water beneath your land is inseparable from protecting the farm itself. Jessica's phone chimed again, and she excused herself to take the call in the next room. When she returned a few minutes later, her expression was grim. That was my contact at the county clerk's office, she explained. Reynolds has filed a petition claiming historical water usage rights that predate current property boundaries. He's arguing that his company's adjacent land holdings give him partial rights to the aquifer regardless of who owns this property. Herbert's face darkened. That's nonsense. My family has documented water usage going back to the 1890s, which is exactly why your records are so valuable, Colonel Mitchell said, tapping the leather ledger. But we should expect legal challenges. Reynolds clearly isn't going to walk away without a fight. Jessica sat down, her expression thoughtful. There's something else we should consider. If Reynolds is filing water rights claims, he might be preparing for a scenario where Herbert keeps the farm but loses control of the water beneath it. Can he do that? Herbert asked, alarm evident in his voice. Water law is complex, Colonel Mitchell replied. In some cases, surface rights and water rights can be separated, especially if historical usage patterns can be documented from adjacent properties. Herbert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So even if we save the farm, Reynolds could still gain control of the water? That would leave me at his mercy during drought years. It's a possibility we need to prepare for, Colonel Mitchell acknowledged. But your family's documentation gives us strong counter-evidence. Before Herbert could respond, they heard the sound of tires on gravel. Through the kitchen window, they saw Brandon Reynolds' sports car pulling up beside Colonel Mitchell's SUV. Seems we're popular today, Herbert muttered, moving toward the door. Brandon Reynolds stood awkwardly on the porch, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt. Without his father's commanding presence, he seemed younger, less certain. Mr. Wilson, he began, I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to speak with you privately. Herbert regarded him with cautious curiosity. Seems like a day for conversations. Come in. Brandon followed Herbert into the kitchen, hesitating when he saw Colonel Mitchell and Jessica at the table surrounded by documents. I can come back another time, he offered. You've driven all this way, Herbert replied. Say your piece. Brandon glanced at the others, then straightened his posture with visible resolve. I came to apologize for my father's approach yesterday, and to warn you that he's escalating his efforts to secure water rights to your property. Jessica and Colonel Mitchell exchanged significant looks while Herbert studied the young man carefully. "Your father wouldn't approve of this visit, would he?" Herbert asked directly. Brandon shook his head. "No, sir, he wouldn't. But I believe his approach is short-sighted and potentially harmful to the broader agricultural community." "Please, sit down," Herbert offered, pulling out a chair. "Coffee?" Brandon accepted both offers, settling at the table with evident discomfort under Colonel Mitchell's scrutiny. "Why are you here, Mr. Reynolds?" the colonel asked directly, beyond offering warnings and apologies. Brandon's fingers tapped nervously against his coffee mug. "My father built Reynolds Agricorp from nothing. He's brilliant at what he does, consolidating inefficient operations into profitable enterprises. But he treats farming purely as a business, with no regard for its history or community impact." "And you see it differently?" Jessica prompted when he paused. "I studied agricultural sustainability at university," Brandon explained. "I believe there's a middle path between my father's corporate approach and traditional family farming, one that respects both economic realities and agricultural heritage." He looked directly at Herbert. "Your farm represents something important that shouldn't be erased in the name of efficiency." Herbert wasn't entirely convinced. "While I appreciate the sentiment, your family name is still on the water rights petition threatening my property." Brandon winced. "Yes, and I can't stop that process now that it's begun. But I can provide information that might help you counter it effectively." Colonel Mitchell leaned forward. "What kind of information?" "The geological surveys my father mentioned. They're more extensive than he admitted. Our company mapped underground water resources throughout the county last year." Brandon reached into his jacket and produced a flash drive. "This contains the complete data set, including projections showing how aggressive water extraction from centralized points could affect surrounding properties over time." Jessica took the drive, her expression mixing surprise and gratitude. "This could be crucial for demonstrating the broader impact of water rights consolidation." "Why would you give us this?" Herbert asked, suspicious of the unexpected assistance. "You're undermining your father's business strategy." Brandon's expression grew somber. "Because I've seen what happens in communities where one company gains control of essential water resources. Family farms wither within years, unable to negotiate fair water access terms. The agricultural diversity disappears, replaced by monoculture. Eventually, the small towns themselves collapse as independent farmers are replaced by seasonal corporate workers." Herbert studied the young man's face, searching for any sign of deception. He saw only genuine concern. "Your father won't be pleased when he discovers what you've done," Colonel Mitchell observed. "No," Brandon agreed quietly. "He won't. But sometimes you have to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right." His gaze met Herbert's. "I think you understand that better than most, sir." The statement hung in the air, resonating with Herbert's own history of difficult choices, leaving the farm to serve in Vietnam, supporting his son's decision to join the military despite his own experiences of war, prioritizing his wife's medical care over the farm's financial security. "The information on this drive," Jessica said, breaking the silence, "how damaging would it be to your father's petition? It shows that aggressive water extraction from the aquifer would substantially impact water availability on neighboring properties within 3 to 5 years, Brandon explained. Essentially, it confirms that whoever controls this access point effectively controls agricultural water resources for much of the county, Colonel Mitchell's expression grew more determined. This transforms the scope of our case significantly. It's no longer just about preserving one veteran's farm. It's about preventing resource monopolization that could devastate an entire agricultural community. Herbert felt the weight of this broader responsibility settling uncomfortably on his shoulders. He'd never sought to be at the center of a regional water rights battle. He'd only wanted to preserve his family's legacy and continue the farming tradition he'd inherited. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said quietly, more to himself than the others. Brandon regarded him sympathetically. Few people who find themselves at historical inflection points ever do, Mr. Wilson, but here you are nonetheless. The young man's unexpected eloquence surprised Herbert. Perhaps there was more to Clayton Reynolds' son than he had initially assumed. "What happens when your father discovers you've shared this information?" Herbert asked, genuinely concerned for the young man, despite their family's opposing interests. Brandon managed a wry smile. "Probably formal disinheritance at minimum. But I've been preparing for this possibility. I have my own resources and connections in sustainable agriculture." "It's a significant risk," Colonel Mitchell observed. "Are you certain it's one you're willing to take?" "Some things matter more than security or inheritance," Brandon replied simply. "The agricultural future of this region is one of them." Herbert recognized something in the young man's resolve, the same principled determination he'd seen in his own son Michael before he'd left for military service. The memory brought both pain and pride. "Thank you," Herbert said finally, extending his hand across the table. "Whatever comes of this, I won't forget what you've done today." Brandon shook his hand firmly. "I should go before I'm missed at the office. My father has called an emergency strategy meeting for this afternoon, presumably to discuss accelerating the water rights petition." After Brandon departed, the three of them sat in contemplative silence for a moment, absorbing the implications of this unexpected development. "I need to get this information to our legal team immediately," Colonel Mitchell said, gesturing toward the flash drive. "This could fundamentally shift our approach." Jessica was already connecting the drive to her laptop. "I want to review the data first, confirm what Brandon told us about the regional impact." Herbert stood and walked to the window, watching Brandon's car disappear down the driveway. The morning sun illuminated his fields, the crops struggling but still growing despite the drought conditions. Beneath them lay water, life-giving water that could determine the fate not just of his own farm but potentially of independent agriculture throughout the county. "When I woke up yesterday," he said quietly, "I thought I was fighting to save my farm for myself and my family's memory. Now it seems I'm fighting for something much larger." Colonel Mitchell joined him at the window. "That's often how it goes. With the most important battles, Herbert, they start personal but become about principles larger than ourselves." Herbert nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. "Well, Colonel, I've never been one to back down from a necessary fight. What's our next move?" The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity that transformed Herbert's quiet farmhouse into an impromptu command center. Colonel Mitchell had summoned a team of specialists, a water rights attorney from the Department of Agriculture, an agricultural economist, and a hydrologist, all arriving with laptops, specialized equipment, and determined expressions. Herbert watched with a mixture of amazement and discomfort as these professionals spread their operations throughout. His home, The dining room became a legal war room, with documents covering every surface. The living room housed geological survey equipment and detailed topographical maps. The front porch served as a meeting area where strategy sessions continued late. Into the evening. "I feel like I'm back in the service," Herbert commented to Colonel Mitchell as they reviewed updated property assessments on the third morning. All this coordinated activity, everyone with their specific mission. Colonel Mitchell smiled slightly. "The principles are similar. Identify the objective, gather intelligence, coordinate specialized units, develop a strategy." She closed the folder she'd been reviewing. "How are you holding up with all this disruption?" Herbert considered the question seriously. "Honestly, it's overwhelming. 2 weeks ago, I thought I was going to lose everything. Now I have government experts calculating the economic value of water rights I didn't even know were significant." "It's a lot to process," Colonel Mitchell acknowledged. "But you remain central to everything we're doing. This isn't about bureaucrats taking over your fight. It's about providing you with the resources needed to win it." Before Herbert could respond, Jessica entered with the water rights attorney, Caroline Mendez, a sharp-eyed woman whose no-nonsense demeanor reminded Herbert of his late wife. "We've reviewed the county records going back to territorial days," Caroline announced, placing a stack of documents on the table. "The Wilson family's water usage documentation is exceptionally thorough. Your grandfather's obsessive record-keeping may save this farm." "Grandpa John believed in documenting everything," Herbert said proper paperwork prevented property disputes." "Smart man," Caroline replied appreciatively. "These records establish continuous beneficial use of the aquifer since 1893, which gives us a strong case for senior water rights under the doctrine of prior appropriation." Herbert nodded, though the legal terminology remained somewhat foreign to him. "And that counters Reynolds' petition?" "It significantly undermines it," Caroline confirmed. "Reynolds is claiming historical usage rights from adjacent properties his company has acquired, but those documented usages began decades after your family's." Jessica pulled out her tablet, displaying a map of the county with property boundaries overlaid. "The data Brandon provided confirms our suspicions. Reynolds has been systematically acquiring properties around yours, particularly those with historical water access points." Herbert studied the map, surprised by the pattern that emerged. "He's been surrounding me." "Precisely," Jessica agreed. "But he missed the critical piece. Your property sits atop the primary access point to the deepest part of the aquifer. The other access points are secondary, with limited flow rates compared to what's beneath Willow Creek Farm." The hydrologist, Dr. Patel, joined them, carrying soil core samples in clear plastic tubes. "The aquifer configuration is quite remarkable," he explained, his voice carrying the excitement of scientific discovery. "It's a confined aquifer with an unusual geological formation that channels much of the water directly beneath the northwest corner of your property." "The old spring field," Herbert said immediately. "That area never dries up completely, even in the worst droughts." "Exactly." Dr. Patel's eyes lit up. "That's the surface manifestation of the aquifer's primary pressure point. Reynolds' geological survey identified it correctly, but what they may not have fully appreciated is its relationship to the entire regional water system." Colonel Mitchell leaned forward. Meaning, Dr. Patel continued, that whoever controls water extraction at that point effectively influences water availability throughout the connected aquifer system. If aggressive pumping occurred there, it could potentially lower the water, table across thousands of surrounding acres, Herbert felt the weight of this information settling on his shoulders. So, Reynolds doesn't just want my land for efficiency. He wants control of the water tap for the entire county. That appears to be the case, Caroline confirmed. And under current water law, if he gained control of that primary access point, surrounding landowners would have limited recourse as their wells dried up. Herbert stood, abruptly, needing space to process this revelation. He walked to the window, gazing out at fields that had been in his family for generations. The implications extended far beyond his personal situation. This was about the agricultural future of the entire region. "What options do we have?" he asked finally, turning back to face the assembled experts. Colonel Mitchell exchanged glances with Caroline before responding. "We're developing several parallel strategies. The first is straightforward. Secure your property through the Veterans Land Retention Program, ensuring the land and water rights remain under your control. Reynolds will challenge that," Caroline noted. "He's already filed a preliminary injunction questioning the program's authority to override existing foreclosure proceedings." "Which brings us to our second approach," Colonel Mitchell continued. "We're exploring the possibility of establishing a protected water trust for the aquifer, with usage rights allocated based on historical documentation and sustainable extraction limits." Herbert frowned. "A water trust? I'm not familiar with the concept." "It's a legal framework that would recognize the aquifer as a shared resource rather than a private one," Caroline explained. "Individual property owners would maintain access, rights proportional to their historical usage, but no single entity could monopolize or deplete the resource. Creating such a trust would require significant community support," Jessica added, "but it would protect independent farmers from being at the mercy of corporate water control." Herbert considered this carefully. "So even if I retain my farm, I'd be sharing decision-making about the water beneath it? You'd have primary rights based on your family's documented historical usage," Caroline clarified. "But yes, extraction rates would be governed by sustainability guidelines rather than solely by property ownership." Herbert wasn't entirely comfortable with this concept. Generations of Wilsons had made independent decisions about their land and resources. The idea of committee-based water management felt foreign to his deeply ingrained sense of property rights. "I understand your hesitation," Colonel Mitchell said, reading his expression accurately. "This approach represents a different relationship to the land and its resources than what you've known all your life." Herbert nodded slowly. "My father and grandfather would have balked at the idea. They believed a man's land was his own to manage as he saw fit." "Different times demand different solutions," Jessica suggested gently. "When your grandfather was farming, water scarcity wasn't the existential threat it is becoming today." Before Herbert could respond, they heard vehicles approaching. Through the window, he saw Emily's SUV pulling up, followed by a sedan he didn't recognize. "That's my daughter," he said, moving toward the door with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He hadn't seen Emily in almost 6 months, and he wasn't entirely prepared for her to witness the transformed state of her childhood home. Emily Wilson Carter stepped from her vehicle, a slender woman in her late 30s, with Herbert's determined, a chin in her mother's warm brown eyes. Behind her emerged her husband David and their 2 children, 12-year-old Michael, named for his fallen uncle, and 9-year-old Sarah. Herbert met them on the porch, temporarily setting aside the weight of water rights and legal strategies as Emily embraced him fiercely. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying the slight catch that always reminded him of Margaret. "You look better than I expected." "Nothing like a good fight to put colour in an old man's cheeks," Herbert replied, returning her embrace before greeting David with a firm handshake and gathering his grandchildren close. Behind them, a tall man in his 50s emerged from the sedan, approaching with the measured gait of someone familiar with farm life. "Herbert," the man called, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Been a long time." Herbert stared in surprise, recognition dawning slowly. "Thomas Harmon, Jessica's father?" Thomas nodded, extending his hand. "Jessica said you could use some community support. Thought I'd come see for myself what's happening." He glanced past Herbert at the collection of government vehicles parked in the yard. "Looks like you've got quite the operation going." Herbert shook Thomas's hand, touched by the gesture from his old neighbor. "It's become more complicated than I ever imagined," he admitted. "Come inside, all of you. There's coffee, and you should meet the team that's trying to save Willow Creek Farm." As they entered the house, Herbert watched Emily's expression shift from shock to curiosity as she took in the transformed space. The children's eyes widened at the maps, equipment, and bustling activity. "Dad," Emily whispered, "what exactly have you gotten yourself into?" Herbert managed a wry smile. "Apparently, a water rights battle that could determine the agricultural future of the entire county." After introductions and a briefing on the situation, Emily pulled Herbert aside while the others continued discussions around the dining room table. "Why didn't you tell me how serious this had become?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "When I contacted Congressman Anderson, I was just trying to delay the auction, not start a regional water rights crusade." Herbert sighed, feeling the weight of his years. "I didn't know myself until a few days ago. The water beneath this farm, it's more significant than anyone realized." Reynolds knew, though. He's been planning this for years, buying up surrounding properties, positioning himself to control the water when drought years hit hard. Emily studied her father's face. "And now you're the only thing standing in his way." "Apparently so," Herbert acknowledged. "Not exactly how I plan to spend my 70s. Emily's expression softened. "Mom would be proud, you know. She always said you were at your best when fighting for something bigger than yourself." Herbert felt his throat tighten at the mention of Margaret. "She was the fighter in the family. I just wanted to farm my land in peace." "Sometimes peace isn't an option," Emily replied gently. "Not when something valuable is at stake." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of more vehicles approaching. 3 this time, including Clayton Reynolds' black SUV. "Now what?" Herbert muttered, moving to the window. Colonel Mitchell joined him, her expression tightening as she recognized Reynolds emerging from his vehicle, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather portfolio. "That's Lawrence." "Werner," Caroline identified from behind them. "Reynolds' chief legal counsel. This isn't a social call." Herbert straightened his shoulders. "I'd better go see what they want." "We'll come with you," Colonel Mitchell said firmly, with Caroline nodding in agreement. As Herbert stepped onto the porch, he was surprised to see a third vehicle pulling up. A news van from the regional television station. A reporter and cameraman quickly exited, equipment in hand. Reynolds approached the porch with confident strides, Werner at his side. His expression registered brief surprise at seeing Colonel Mitchell and Caroline flanking Herbert. "Herbert," Reynolds greeted him with forced cordiality. "I see you've expanded your team." "Clayton," Herbert acknowledged. "Seems you've brought reinforcements of your own." He nodded toward the news crew setting up nearby. "And an audience." Reynolds smiled thinly. "Transparency is important in matters affecting regional resources. The public deserves to know what's happening with their water supply." "Their water supply," Herbert repeated pointedly. "Not Reynolds AgriCorp's private reserve." The lawyer, Werner, stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson, we've come to present a formal offer that would resolve the current situation amicably." He opened his portfolio and extracted a document. "My client is prepared to purchase your property at 20% above market value, with an additional provision allowing you lifetime residency rights to the farmhouse and immediate surrounding acreage." Herbert heard the door open behind him as others from inside came to observe the exchange. He felt Jessica's supportive presence at his shoulder. "That's very generous," Herbert replied carefully. "But it doesn't address the broader concerns about water access for the wider agricultural community." Reynolds' expression hardened slightly. "Herbert, I'm trying to offer you a dignified resolution. You keep your home, receive fair compensation, and avoid a protracted legal battle you simply can't afford." "Perhaps Mr. Wilson is more concerned with the community's future than his personal comfort," Colonel Mitchell suggested coolly. Reynolds turned his attention to her. "Colonel, with all due respect, this is a private business matter between Mr. Wilson and my company. Your federal program, while well-intentioned, is overstepping by interfering in established foreclosure proceedings." "On the contrary," Caroline interjected, stepping forward with professional confidence, "the Veterans Land Retention Program operates under clear statutory authority, and Mr. Wilson's eligibility is well established." Werner smiled condescendingly. "We've filed challenges to both the program's jurisdiction and Mr. Wilson's qualification. The courts will ultimately determine those questions." Herbert watched this exchange with growing clarity. Reynolds was attempting to intimidate them with legal threats, while simultaneously offering what seemed like a generous personal solution, all carefully staged for the waiting news cameras. "What happens to the water rights under your proposal?" Herbert asked directly, cutting through the legal posturing. Reynolds hesitated fractionally. "Natural resources would be managed according to standard agricultural best practices." "That's not an answer," Jessica called out from behind Herbert. "Would surrounding farms maintain their historical water access, or would they become dependent on Reynolds AgriCorp's extraction and distribution decisions?" The reporter had moved closer, clearly intrigued by this exchange. Reynolds glanced at the camera with evident discomfort before composing himself. "Water management is complex and requires significant investment in infrastructure and conservation technology," he replied smoothly. "Our company is best positioned to ensure sustainable access for the entire region. Under your control and at your prices," Thomas Harmon added, joining Herbert on the porch. "Some of us remember what happened in Dawson County when Meridian Agriculture took control of their primary water access points. Independent farms collapsed within 3 years. Reynolds' expression darkened at this unexpected intervention. "The situations are entirely different. We're offering a solution that benefits everyone." Herbert felt something solidifying within him, a certainty that had been building since Brandon's visit. Reynolds's carefully orchestrated proposal and the presence of news cameras confirmed what was really at stake. "I appreciate your offer," Herbert said clearly, aware of the recording camera, "but I'm not interested in selling Willow Creek Farm. My focus now is on ensuring that the water beneath this land remains accessible to the broader agricultural community, not controlled by any single corporation." Reynolds' facade of congeniality slipped momentarily. "You're making a mistake, Herbert. This offer won't remain open indefinitely." "Then I suggest you direct your energies elsewhere," Herbert replied evenly. "My family has safeguarded this land and its resources for 4 generations. I don't intend to be the one who surrenders it to corporate control." The reporter moved. Closer, microphone extended. "Mr. Wilson, are you saying you've rejected Reynolds AgriCorp's offer? Can you explain your concerns about water rights?" Herbert had never sought public attention, but he recognized the opportunity before him. With cameras recording, he could frame this not as a personal battle, but as a community issue. "This isn't just about my farm," he said, his voice growing stronger. "The aquifer beneath this land serves farmers throughout the county. Whoever controls it effectively controls the agricultural future of this region. That's too important to be decided by a forced auction or private sale." The reporter turned to Reynolds. "Mr. Reynolds, would you like to respond to these concerns about water monopolization?" Reynolds maintained his composure, though Herbert could see tension in his jawline. "We're simply trying to modernize agricultural infrastructure in a region facing increasing climate challenges. Mr. Wilson's characterization is unfortunate and inaccurate." As Reynolds and his attorney retreated to their vehicle, Herbert felt a slight tremor in his legs, the aftermath of confrontation and the weight of public declaration. But underneath the physical fatigue was a growing certainty that he had taken the right stand, not just for himself, but for something truly important. "You did well," Colonel Mitchell said quietly beside him as they watched the vehicles depart. Reynolds wanted footage of a reasonable businessman offering a generous solution to a stubborn old farmer. Instead, he got a principled stand on community water rights. Herbert nodded, watching as his grandchildren peered curiously from the doorway, witnesses to a moment they were too young to fully understand, but would perhaps remember when they were older. "When I was their age," he said, nodding toward the children, "my grandfather told me we don't really own the land. We just borrow it from future generations." He turned back to Colonel Mitchell. "I'm beginning to think the same might be true of water." The news report aired that evening across 4 counties, framing the dispute not as a simple foreclosure, but as a David versus Goliath battle over regional water resources. Herbert watched uncomfortably from his armchair, unused to seeing his face on television or hearing his words broadcast to thousands of viewers. The reporter had done a surprisingly thorough job, interviewing several neighboring farmers about their water concerns and providing historical context about agricultural consolidation in the region. "You came across well, Dad," Emily said, sitting on the sofa beside her children, who were enjoying the novelty of seeing their grandfather on television. "Authentic and principled," Herbert grunted noncommittally. "Never meant to become the poster boy for water rights." "Sometimes we don't choose our battles," Thomas Harmon observed from where he stood leaning against the doorframe. "Sometimes they choose us." Colonel Mitchell entered the living room, phone in hand, her expression thoughtful. "That report is generating significant attention. My office has received calls from 3 congressional offices and the State Agricultural Commissioner." Herbert raised his eyebrows. "Because of one local news segment?" Water is becoming the defining issue in agricultural regions throughout the West, Colonel Mitchell explained. Your situation encapsulates concerns that many communities are facing. Caroline Mendez joined them, tablet in hand. Reynolds' legal team has been busy too. They've filed an emergency motion contesting the auction delay and questioning federal jurisdiction in what they're characterizing as a private commercial foreclosure. Can they do that? Emily asked, concern evident in her voice. They can try, Caroline replied, her tone suggesting professional anticipation rather than worry. But we anticipated this move. Judge Hamilton has scheduled a hearing for next Wednesday to address jurisdictional questions. Herbert sighed heavily. So this goes to court now? Just a preliminary hearing, Caroline clarified. But yes, we should expect a legal battle alongside the public relations campaign Reynolds has clearly initiated. Herbert stood, feeling the need for fresh air and space to think. I'm going to check on the Northfield irrigation. Too many lawyers and cameras for one day. Emily started to rise, but Jessica, who had been quietly observing from the corner, caught her eye and shook her head slightly. Understanding her father's need for solitude, Emily remained seated. Outside, the evening air carried the sweet scent of alfalfa from a neighboring farm. Herbert walked slowly toward the equipment shed, his mind churning with the day's developments. What had begun as a desperate last stand to save his family farm had morphed into something far larger, with implications beyond anything he'd anticipated. Inside the shed, Herbert ran his hand along the fender of his old tractor, a John Deere that had been his father's pride and joy 40 years earlier. Like everything on the farm, it showed signs of age, but remained functional through careful maintenance and timely repairs. Just like me, Herbert murmured to himself with grim humor. Talking to tractors now? A voice asked from the doorway. Herbert turned to find Jessica entering the shed, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Old farmer's habit, he replied, accepting the offered cup with gratitude. My father used to say machines work better if they know they're appreciated. Jessica smiled, settling on a nearby workbench. My dad says the same thing. Family superstitions die hard in farming. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the evening light slanting through dusty windows to create golden patterns on the concrete floor. This is all happening very fast, Herbert finally said. Reynolds, the water rights, the legal challenges, news cameras. I feel like I'm riding a runaway horse. Jessica nodded, understanding. It's a lot to process. But you're not alone in this, Herbert. You have more support than you realize. Herbert sipped his coffee, allowing its warmth to counter the evening chill. I meant what I said to Reynolds about community access to water, but I'm still trying to reconcile that with my family's traditional views about property rights. Your grandfather's generation couldn't have anticipated today's challenges, Jessica observed. Climate change, corporate agriculture, water scarcity, these require new thinking about resources we once took for granted. Herbert studied her thoughtfully. You're very wise for someone so young. Jessica laughed softly. Not wise. Just educated about issues facing modern agriculture. The principles that matter to you, stewardship, sustainability, community, those remain constant. It's just the application that evolves. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Emily appeared in the doorway, her expression unusually serious. Dad, you need to come back to the house. Brandon Reynolds just arrived. Alone. He says it's urgent. Herbert and Jessica exchanged concerned glances before following Emily back. toward the farmhouse. The young Reynolds was waiting on the porch, his posture tense, his expression troubled. "Mr. Wilson," he began as Herbert approached, "I apologize for coming unannounced, but there's something you need to know immediately." "Come inside," Herbert offered, noting the young man's evident distress. Brandon shook his head. "Better if we talk privately. What I'm about to tell you could have serious legal implications." Colonel Mitchell emerged from the house, her military training evident in her immediate assessment of the situation. "Mr. Reynolds, anything you share with Herbert will likely need to be disclosed to his legal team." Brandon hesitated, then nodded in resignation. "That's fair. The important thing is that you're prepared for what's coming." He took a deep breath. "My father has accelerated his plans. He's filing for an emergency injunction tomorrow morning, claiming that continued agricultural operations on your property risk depleting water resources that serve the broader community." Herbert stared in disbelief. "That's absurd. My farm uses less water than most operations half its size. We've always practiced conservation." "The claim isn't based on current usage," Brandon explained grimly. "It's based on potential impact. If aggressive irrigation were implemented, he's essentially arguing that your farm represents a potential threat to the aquifer's sustainability." Caroline had joined them on the porch, her legal mind immediately grasping the strategy. "He's trying to flip the narrative, positioning himself as the responsible steward, protecting community resources from potential mismanagement." "Exactly," Brandon confirmed. "The filing includes affidavits from 2 agricultural engineers suggesting that independent farming operations lack the technological resources to implement proper water conservation measures." Jessica's expression darkened with indignation. "That's demonstrably false. Small farms often have better water efficiency practices than corporate operations." "Truth isn't necessarily the point," Caroline observed. "This is about creating legal obstacles and shaping public perception while we're still establishing our case." Herbert felt a familiar sensation building in his chest. The same righteous anger that had fueled him through 2 tours in Vietnam when confronted with injustice or manipulation. "So Reynolds is claiming I might misuse water that's been under my family's responsible management for generations, while positioning himself as the community's protector." Brandon nodded, his expression apologetic. "The legal filing is accompanied by a PR campaign. He's organized a town hall meeting tomorrow evening to discuss regional water security and sustainable agricultural practices. Several farmers who already lease land from Reynolds AgriCorp are prepared to testify about corporate water management benefits." Colonel Mitchell's expression remained composed, but Herbert could see calculation in her eyes. "This is a coordinated offensive, legal, public relations, and community pressure simultaneously." "I had to warn you," Brandon said quietly. "My father is playing to win, and he's bringing every resource he has to bear." Herbert studied the young man carefully. "You've taken an enormous risk coming here again. If your father discovers you've been warning us about his strategies—" "He already suspects," Brandon interrupted, his voice tight with emotion. "We had a significant disagreement after I questioned the ethics of the emergency injunction. He's asked for my resignation from the company, effective immediately." A heavy silence followed this revelation. Herbert felt a surge of responsibility for this young man's precarious position. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I never intended to create a rift between you and your father." Brandon shook his head. "This rift has been developing for years. Your situation just brought our different values into sharper focus. He managed a small, sad smile. Besides, I have a degree in sustainable agriculture that I've never properly used. Perhaps it's time I put it to work. Jessica stepped forward. My family's organic operation could use someone with your educational background and corporate experience. If you're looking for a position... Brandon's expression brightened slightly. I'd like to talk about that possibility, but right now we need to focus on countering tomorrow's legal offensive. Caroline was already typing rapidly on her tablet. I'll alert Judge Hamilton's clerk about the pending emergency filing. We can prepare counter-arguments tonight. The town hall meeting is potentially more damaging, Colonel Mitchell observed. Public perception will influence both legal outcomes and community support. Herbert nodded thoughtfully. Then we need to be there, presenting our own vision for regional water management. He turned to Jessica. Contact the neighbors, Thomas, the Hendersons, the Grahams, anyone who understands what's really at stake here. Emily, who had been listening intently, spoke up. I'll reach out to my college roommate Sarah. She's an environmental journalist with the state paper now. This story needs broader coverage than just local news. As the group dispersed to implement these immediate countermeasures, Herbert found himself alone with Brandon on the porch. The younger man seemed both relieved to have delivered his warning and uncertain about his next steps. Your father is a determined man, Herbert observed, breaking the silence. Brandon nodded. He built Reynolds AgriCorp from nothing. In his mind, that success justifies whatever methods he employs. And what about in your mind? Herbert asked. Directly, Brandon considered the question carefully. I believe in agricultural innovation and efficiency, values my father claims to champion. But I also believe in community, sustainability, and respecting the complex relationships between land, water, and people. He met Herbert's gaze steadily. Those aren't just sentimental notions. They're practical necessities for long-term agricultural viability. Herbert nodded, recognizing in this young man's words echoes of conversations he'd had with his own son decades earlier. Discussions about balancing tradition with necessary change, about finding meaning in work beyond mere profit. You remind me of my Michael, Herbert said quietly. He had that same clarity about right and wrong, even when it wasn't convenient. Brandon looked surprised by the comparison. I've seen his photo inside, your son who died in the Gulf War. Herbert nodded, the familiar ache of loss briefly intensifying. He saw things clearly, argued passionately for what he believed in. Your willingness to stand against your father's methods, even at personal cost, Michael would have understood that kind of courage. The comparison clearly moved Brandon, who seemed at a loss for words. Finally, he squared his shoulders, as if accepting both the compliment and the responsibility it implied. I should go. There's a lot to prepare before tomorrow. Herbert extended his hand. Thank you for the warning. Whatever happens with the legal battles ahead, you've done the right thing. After Brandon departed, Herbert remained on the porch, watching as the last light faded from the western sky. Inside the house, he could hear the productive bustle of preparation. Phone calls being made, documents being reviewed, strategies being formulated. Emily emerged from the house, carrying a fresh cup of coffee, which she silently offered to her father. You've built quite a coalition in just a few days, she observed, settling beside him on the porch swing that had been a fixture of their family home for 3 generations. Herbert accepted the coffee gratefully. Not me. Colonel Mitchell, Jessica, Caroline. They're the ones organizing everything. I'm just the old farmer who happened to sit on important water. Emily studied him in the gathering dusk. Give yourself more credit, Dad. They're all here because of who you are, not just what's under your land. Herbert raised a questioning eyebrow. Your integrity, your history of service, your commitment to this community, those things matter, Emily continued. Reynolds might have all the money and legal resources, but you have something he'll never understand. What's that? Moral. Authority, Emily replied simply. People know who you are and what you stand for. That carries weight. Herbert considered his daughter's words, warming his hands on the coffee mug as the evening air cooled around them. He'd never thought of himself as having any particular authority, moral or otherwise. He'd simply tried to live by the values his parents had instilled: honesty, hard work, service to country and community, stewardship of the land entrusted to his care. Your mother would be proud of you, he said after a moment. Taking on this, right when I was ready to surrender. Emily smiled, the expression so reminiscent of Margaret that Herbert felt his heart constrict. Mom never surrendered anything without a fight. Remember when the bank tried to deny that equipment loan during the 90s recession? She marched in with 3 years of meticulous financial records and refused to leave until they reconsidered. Herbert chuckled at the memory. Stubborn woman. Manager finally approved the loan just to get her out of his office. She'd be right beside you in this water rights battle, Emily said confidently, probably organizing the community response. Herself. Herbert nodded, feeling Margaret's absence acutely in this moment of crisis. For 45 years, she had been his partner in every challenge the farm had faced. Facing Reynolds without her felt like fighting with one arm tied behind his back. Their quiet reflection was interrupted by Colonel Mitchell stepping onto the porch, her posture communicating urgency without alarm. Caroline's contact at the courthouse. Just called. Reynolds' legal team has already filed their emergency injunction. They've somehow secured an expedited hearing for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Herbert frowned. I thought Brandon said they were filing tomorrow. It appears. They accelerated their timeline, Colonel Mitchell replied, possibly as insurance in case their strategy was leaked. Emily stood immediately alert. What does this mean for us? It means we'll be in court tomorrow instead of having a day to prepare, Colonel Mitchell explained. Caroline is already working on our response, but we'll need Herbert ready to testify about his farm's water conservation practices. Herbert nodded, setting aside his coffee. I've managed this land for over 50 years. I can speak to our water usage in my sleep. Good, Colonel Mitchell said. Because Reynolds' filing specifically questions the wisdom of leaving critical water resources in the hands of a single elderly farmer with limited resources and outdated agricultural practices. Herbert felt his face flush with indignation. Outdated practices. My father implemented contour ploughing and crop rotation when Reynolds' father was still working at the gas station in town. Emily placed a calming hand on her father's arm. That's exactly the kind of specific knowledge you'll need to share in court, Dad. Your family's history of conservation and innovation. The hearing is procedural, Colonel Mitchell added, but significant. If Reynolds secures this injunction, it could establish a legal precedent that water management requires corporate-level resources, potentially undermining the entire premise of independent agricultural operations. Herbert understood the stakes clearly now. This wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about the viability of family farming itself in an era of increasing resource pressures. Reynolds wants to turn water into a commodity that only corporations can effectively manage, he said slowly, articulating the realization as it formed. Once that principle is established legally, independent farms become unsustainable by definition. Colonel Mitchell nodded, her expression grave. Exactly. Which is why tomorrow's hearing matters far beyond Willow Creek Farm. As they returned, inside to prepare for the morning's legal battle, Herbert felt a strange calm, replacing his earlier indignation. The path forward had clarified. Not easier, certainly, but clearer in its purpose and significance. In the dining room, Caroline was reviewing decades of Wilson family farm records, building a case for responsible stewardship. Jessica and her father were mapping regional water usage patterns. Emily was on the phone with her journalist friend, carefully explaining the broader implications of what appeared on the surface to be a simple foreclosure dispute. Herbert moved among them, providing historical context, answering questions about farming practices, offering forgotten details about water management decisions made decades earlier. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt fully engaged with a purpose larger than daily survival, connected to both past and future in a struggle that mattered. As midnight approached, Herbert finally insisted that everyone get some rest before the morning's hearing. As the house gradually quieted, he found himself alone in the kitchen, making one final cup of coffee despite the late hour. His gaze drifted to Margaret's photo on the wall, taken on their 40th anniversary, her eyes bright with the wisdom and humor that had sustained them through decades of challenges. "Well, Margaret," he said softly to the empty room, "it seems I'm not quite finished fighting after all. Reynolds thinks an old farmer can't properly manage water resources." He smiled slightly, remembering Margaret's fierce confidence in challenging conventional wisdom. "I think tomorrow we'll show him exactly what an old farmer knows about stewardship." The courthouse steps were already crowded when Herbert arrived the next morning. Word of the hearing had spread throughout the farming community, drawing dozens of local farmers, many of whom Herbert had known for decades. They nodded respectfully as he climbed the steps, Colonel Mitchell and Caroline flanking him like honor guards. Inside, the courtroom was equally packed. Clayton Reynolds sat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by attorneys in expensive suits. His expression betrayed momentary surprise at the community turnout before settling back into confident determination. Judge Sandra Morales, known for her no-nonsense approach and deep understanding of agricultural issues, called the court to order precisely at 9. Herbert listened as Reynolds' lead attorney presented their case, painting a picture of an outdated farm operation sitting atop critical water resources needed by the entire region. When Caroline rose to respond, her approach was methodical and devastating. She presented Herbert's military service record, his family's multi-generational conservation practices, and most damaging to Reynolds' case, water usage data showing that Willow Creek Farm had consistently used less water per acre than Reynolds' corporate operations. "Your Honor," Caroline concluded, "this injunction request isn't about protecting water resources. It's a transparent attempt to wrest control of a critical aquifer access point from a veteran who has managed it responsibly for over 5 decades. When Herbert's turn to testify came, he approached the stand with quiet dignity. For nearly an He answered questions about specific conservation methods his family had implemented, often decades before they became standard practice. He explained the handwritten ledgers documenting water table measurements since 1893 and the irrigation improvements each generation had contributed. "Mr. Wilson," Judge Morales asked directly, "Reynolds Agricorp suggests that modern water management requires corporate resources beyond what an individual farmer can provide. How do you respond?" Herbert considered the question carefully. "Your Honor, corporations measure success in quarterly profits. Farmers measure success in generations. My family has preserved this water resource through 2 world wars, the Dust Bowl, and multiple droughts. We understood its value long before corporations saw it as an asset to exploit." A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. Judge Morales allowed it to subside before addressing Reynolds' attorney. "Counselor, your client's claim that Mr. Wilson lacks resources for proper water management seems contradicted by the historical record. What specifically would Reynolds Agricorp do differently?" The attorney faltered momentarily before launching into a technical explanation of centralized extraction and distribution systems. Herbert recognized the underlying message. Reynolds would control the tap for the entire region. After final arguments, Judge Morales announced she would take a brief recess before ruling. As the courtroom cleared, Herbert found himself surrounded by neighbors and fellow farmers offering support. Thomas Harmon gripped his shoulder wordlessly. The solidarity of men who had worked the land side by side through decades of challenges. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, Judge Morales delivered her ruling with characteristic precision. The court denies the requested emergency injunction. The evidence presented shows no imminent threat to water resources under current management. She looked directly at Reynolds. Furthermore, this court recognizes the legitimate interest of the Veterans Land Retention Program in preventing the foreclosure of qualified properties. The auction suspension will remain in effect pending full program review. Herbert closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over him. It wasn't final victory, but it was crucial breathing room. The judge wasn't finished. However, this dispute highlights broader concerns about regional water security that extend beyond individual property rights. Therefore, I am ordering the establishment of a regional water management council to develop sustainable usage guidelines for the aquifer. This council will include representatives from family farms, agricultural corporations, and relevant government agencies. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Herbert as he descended the steps with his growing coalition of supporters. "Mr. Wilson, what does this ruling mean for Willow Creek Farm?" a journalist called out. Herbert considered his response carefully, aware that his words would reach throughout the agricultural community. "It means that responsible stewardship matters more than corporate power. It means that veterans' service to this country continues to be valued. And most importantly, it means that water, the lifeblood of our community, won't be controlled by a single corporation." As cameras flashed, Herbert noticed Brandon Reynolds standing at the edge of the crowd, a quiet smile of approval on his face. Beside him stood Jessica, already deep in conversation about sustainable farming practices. Herbert recognized the spark between them, not just professional respect, but personal connection, the future taking shape before his eyes. 3 months later, Herbert stood in the northwest field of Willow Creek Farm, watching as workers installed a state-of-the-art moisture monitoring system that would reduce water usage by 30%. The Veterans Land Retention Program had approved his modernization plan, restructuring his debt and providing grants for water conservation technology. The newly formed Regional Water Management Council, with Herbert serving as its first chairperson, had established sustainable extraction, limits and usage priorities that protected both family farms and the regional ecosystem. Reynolds Agricorp remained a powerful presence, but no longer threatened to monopolize the critical resource. Most surprisingly, Brandon Reynolds had resigned permanently from his father's company to partner with Jessica Harmon, establishing a sustainable agriculture consulting firm that helped traditional farms adapt to changing climate conditions. Their first major project was overseeing Willow Creek Farm's transition to partial heritage grain production. Emily and her family had decided to move back to Nebraska, building a new home on the eastern edge of the property. Her husband had found work in the county engineering department, and the children were thriving in the same rural school their mother had attended. As Herbert gazed across fields his great-grandfather had first ploughed, he felt a deep satisfaction. The farm would continue, adapting to new challenges while honoring its history. The water beneath it would sustain not just Willow Creek Farm, but the broader agricultural community for generations to come. The briefcase that had silenced the auction room now sat displayed in the County Historical Museum, alongside the military medals of 4 generations of Wilson men who had served their country in uniform and then as stewards of the land. A simple plaque told visitors how an old farmer's stand against corporate water control had transformed regional agricultural policy. Sometimes the most powerful moments come when someone stands up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Herbert Wilson's courage reminds us that one person's determination can ripple outward, changing not just their own future but an entire community's destiny. If this story touched your heart, remember that there are everyday heroes in your own community, veterans, farmers, and ordinary citizens making extraordinary stands for what matters. Their stories deserve to be told and remembered. Don't miss our next inspiring true story of courage and determination. Subscribe to our channel now and hit that notification bell. Leave a comment telling us what you thought about Herbert's journey, and we'll see you in the next video.